Hey everyone, it's Robert Hall. In today's video, we are going to go over everything you need to know about freezing action in images. Now we're going to cover this in three different scenarios. One would be in outdoor natural light, any type of available light. Two will be in a controlled scenario using flash photography. And three will be if you need to use flash photography outdoors in an uncontrolled environment. Those three situations all call for different approaches, and that's what we're going to go over today. Now, there are two big fundamentals of freezing action. The first would be how fast your subject is moving. So I've got this little car here, and what is cool about it is that I can kind of repeat its speed over and over again depending on where I position it. So it makes it really good for a comparison like this. Stands to reason that if something is moving slowly, it will produce less motion blur than when something moves quickly. The second fundamental is that as you magnify a subject on an image sensor, you are going to increase the amount of motion blur with everything else remaining equal. That means that if we zoom or if we get closer, then the motion blur of that moving subject is going to be magnified. So those are two things that you just have to be aware of whenever you are trying to freeze action. Now, when you're outdoors using available light, or even in a scenario like this where we have constant light lighting the scene, the only method of control you have is your shutter speed. So I actually had to go up to 1/2000th of a second shutter speed just to freeze this little toy vehicle. That means that I had to use an ISO of 5000, and I'm at the maximum aperture on my lens. This presents one of the challenges of relying on just the light that's available in order to freeze the subject, is that you get really restricted with your other settings. Also, there's some limitations. Most cameras have a shutter speed limit of 1/8000th of a second, and some even lower than that, down to 1/4000. That can make certain types of action freezing difficult. For most purposes, capturing athletes, humans, 1/4000 is going to be fast enough shutter speed. That's just going to be quick enough. Most humans don't move much faster than that unless you are really tight using a long focal length because you're magnifying them so much, or they have some type of rotational movement such as dancers. But in general, it becomes difficult because everything else is so restricted. Now, this is where flash comes into play. And most people think by default that because you want to use a high shutter speed to capture a moving subject, that you want to do that with flash as well. And that pushes most people to assume that high-speed sync is the way to go. When you are in an indoor environment or a controlled environment where you can control the available light coming in, that is not the case. You do not want to use high-speed sync. You want to stick with standard sync. Let's demonstrate this. First, we're going to start with what I would call a blank slate. So I'm going to shut down all the ambient light. Now, in my studio, we don't have a ton of ambient light, and I do need to actually light the video, so I'm not going to completely black out the space. But if I weren't doing this for video, I would probably dim the lights in my space. I wouldn't have a light on me. And if you look around our studio, we have covers for all of our blinds so that we can get rid of any of the ambient light coming in. And that just allows for us to easily make the environment very, very dark. Okay, it might not look much different to you, but we just cut a ton of the ambient light in here. We are going to take a quick shot just so you can see what I mean by a completely dark image. So I'm at 1/250th of a second, f4.5, and ISO 100. You can see we have virtually no light on the image. There is a tiny bit of detail. That's not going to affect anything. Step two would be to build your flash setup while keeping in mind that you want to prioritize a low power output. Now, there's multiple ways that you can prioritize keeping your flash power low. First would be to keep your lights as close as possible. The second would be to choose light modifiers that focus your light. That's why I'm using a reflector here. A umbrella would send light everywhere in all directions, whereas a reflector kind of concentrates it into a more focused pattern, which just means that the light intensity is higher over that area. Third would be that you want to use specular reflective surfaces. So you're going to want to use silver as opposed to using white, or you're going to want to avoid diffusion over the front of your modifier. So reflectors are very ideal here, but also silver umbrellas or even paras, those are going to work better than your double diffuse softbox or shoot through umbrella. And the third way that we can keep our flash power very low is to use camera settings that allow the flash to be lower. So increasing our ISO and widening our aperture. And that's where darkening your environment comes into play, because the darker that your environment is, the higher you can increase your ISO, the wider you can make your aperture while still retaining a dark image that has no ambient light. The reason that we take all these steps to prioritize a low power setting on our flash is because the lower that the power setting is, the faster our flash duration is. Now, I'm not going to get into the technicalities of exactly what a T.1 flash duration is. All I'm going to say is that the smaller the number, the better it's going to be at freezing action. Okay, so we have our flash quite close. I'm going to do a quick light test to figure out what power level I need. I'm going to start at 1256 power. Hopefully that's not too much. Sounds ridiculous, but this is a very powerful lighting system. Works better if I turn it on. A little bit overexposed, that's okay. Okay, so I'm at 1512 power, the lowest power setting on this flash, and I actually had to go up to f11 and ISO 100. That's in large part because we are using a reflector, a very specular reflector, so close. So you can see from that first example that it perfectly freezes the car. So now we're gonna push it even more. I'm gonna zoom in here. All right, we are also going to move the car up to the faster line. So you can see in this example, the car is perfectly frozen even though we are zoomed in, even though we are only using a shutter speed of 1/200th of a second. It's just very easy when you follow this process. Another benefit to using this process of getting your lights at a very low power is that you're also able to shoot at continuous burst rates. So you can prioritize high frames per second, which just lends itself to capturing action. Now, following all of this sets you up for your best chances at freezing action in a controlled environment, but there's still some other challenges that can pop up. If you darken your space completely, you're gonna have some trouble focusing, right? It's just tough to focus in really low light conditions, especially if you're not using a very new camera. So you may be tempted to use the modeling lamp on your flash equipment. If you do that, just make sure that you're still getting a completely black image even with the modeling light on. And here we were still able to light our video, but it wasn't impacting the image because of our camera settings. So you have to find that balance. The other thing to be aware of is the type of motion that you're photographing and where its extreme points are. For instance, when I'm shooting this car, it's a very simple lateral motion right across the frame. It's all going in one single direction. However, when you're photographing, say, a dancer, then you're going to get combinations of lateral and rotational movement. And where you typically see the most movement is at the extreme points of something that moves rotationally. So if your subject is leaping and whipping their arms up, it's going to be at the fingertips that are moving the fastest, that are covering the most ground, and that's where your last bit of motion blur will be. So make sure you're checking those spots, because if those spots are solid, I guarantee the face and the body, that part is going to be perfectly frozen as well. And there is the possibility that you are doing everything you possibly can and you're still not getting an image completely free of motion blur. And in that case, it's probably a matter of your flash not being powerful enough. As you work up the ladder of more powerful lights, that means you would have to use lower power settings in order to equal the same amount of light output. So using something like this, a P2400, it is very easy to be at my minimum power of 1/512. However, if I was using a V1 at the same distance, then I'm going to be at a higher power level and get a worse T.1 flash duration. So you can see that the light that you're using makes a huge impact. Okay, now let's talk about going outdoors and trying to use flash to freeze a subject outdoors. If you're, say, doing this at night, where you can completely shut down the ambient light and you're trying to basically make a studio outdoors, well, then all of the studio rules still apply. That would be the approach, and that would give you the most efficient pathway to doing so. But if you're outdoors in daylight, then it is a completely different process. Because the daylight is going to hit your subject, because the daylight is going to be visible in the background and the surroundings of your image, that means that the daylight needs to be frozen in addition to the flash that you're using. And the only way that you can freeze flash and the ambient light at the same time is to use high-speed sync. There are some benefits and some negatives to this. First, the benefit is in high-speed sync, you don't have to be concerned about your power level. There are no T.1 flash durations, so whether you're using a quarter power or full power or an eighth power, it doesn't matter. You basically have the same action freezing potential, and it's tied to your shutter speed. Now keep in mind, if you're in a very bright area and you're using a flash to balance that, and you're in high speed sync, which is more demanding, that's going to be very taxing on your flash, and you're not going to have that fast recycle time that you can rely on when you're in a controlled environment. So it's likely going to be slower. You're going to have longer gaps for recycling, and there may even be an issue with thermal protection on your flash where you have to give it a break in order to continue shooting with it. Now, in general, you will see no negatives when using high-speed sync to freeze action. I have photographed my buddy flying by me on a mountain bike. I shot him at 1/8,000th of a second. Every spoke on his bike, his feet, the gears, his body, everything looks nice and sharp. There are no issues whatsoever with freezing action like this. However, things can get really weird when you use high-speed sync to photograph something that is rotating very quickly. Somebody illustrated this really well on this blog post where they photographed a Dremel spinning, and they put a pattern on it so that you could clearly see what happens to the pattern when photographed in high-speed sync. All right, guys, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you are leaving this with a strong grasp on how to freeze action in any environment, whether that's indoors, whether that's outdoors, without flash. If you have any questions from things I said throughout this video, go ahead and leave it in the comment below. Like the video if you enjoyed, and subscribe if you want to see more. I'll catch you in the next one.